The 1970s gave us Jaws, Star Wars, and The Godfather. But what about the mega productions that vanished without a trace? Hollywood poured millions into star-studded epics and futuristic visions that bombed so hard, studios nearly collapsed. Which Oscar-winning director blew his career on a Western that lost $37 million? And which legendary musician's film was so disastrous it stayed locked in a vault for decades? Here's the celluloid graveyard of cinema's wildest decade. 1. Heaven's Gate, 1978. Michael Cimino rode into this epic Western with an Oscar for The Deer Hunter and rode out with the film that actually killed a major studio. United Artists handed him $7.5 million and watched in horror as the budget ballooned to $44 million while Cimino demanded 50-plus takes for simple scenes and built entire towns only to tear them down and rebuild them a few feet away. The production madness included delaying filming for hours, waiting for perfect cloud formations, and importing a real antique steam locomotive at astronomical cost. The premiere version ran an excruciating 5 hours and 25 minutes. Critics were merciless. Vincent Canby of the New York Times called it an unqualified disaster resembling a forced 4-hour walking tour of one's own living room. Audiences stayed away in droves. The box office tallied a pathetic $3.5 million against its massive budget. United Artists, the studio founded by Charlie Chaplin and D.W. Griffith, financially collapsed and was sold to MGM following the catastrophe. Cimino's promising career never recovered. Hollywood immediately ended its era of director-driven filmmaking, tightening studio control over productions for decades. Heaven's Gate became the textbook definition of creative hubris, a cautionary tale taught in film schools of how one man's unchecked ambition destroyed not just a movie, but an entire studio's legacy. 2. Sorcerer, 1977. William Friedkin followed The Exorcist and The French Connection with this white-knuckle thriller about 4 desperate men transporting unstable dynamite through South American jungle terrain. The production was a legendary nightmare that makes modern blockbusters look like student films. Friedkin rejected both Steve McQueen and Clint Eastwood before casting Roy Scheider, then dragged his crew to the Dominican Republic and Mexico, where tropical diseases, political unrest, and catastrophic weather plagued filming. One jaw-dropping sequence featured trucks crossing a rickety rope bridge during a monsoon. Friedkin built 3 different full-size bridges, each costing hundreds of thousands of dollars because the first 2 were washed away by flash floods. When a key vehicle sank in mud, they needed 8 days and a small army of workers to recover it. The original $15 million budget nearly doubled. Then disaster struck. Sorcerer opened the exact same week as Star Wars. The cosmic timing couldn't have been worse as audiences flocked to George Lucas's space fantasy while ignoring Friedkin's gritty masterpiece. Paramount executives, expecting another Exorcist-level hit, watched in horror as the film earned just $12 million against its $22 million budget. Critics initially dismissed it as a poor remake of the French classic The Wages of Fear. Friedkin's career entered a downward spiral for decades afterward. Only years later did Sorcerer gain recognition as a lost masterpiece, with directors like Quentin Tarantino championing its brilliance, as Friedkin later lamented, "I don't think I'll ever get over it." 3. At Long Last Love, 1975. Peter Bogdanovich was Hollywood royalty after The Last Picture Show and Paper Moon, with enough clout to convince 21st Century Fox to bankroll a lavish 1930s-style musical featuring Cole Porter songs. The twist? He cast non-singers Burt Reynolds and Sybil Shepherd, his girlfriend at the time, in the lead roles and insisted they perform all songs live on set rather than lip-syncing to pre-recorded tracks, a technique not attempted since early Hollywood musicals. The production design dazzled with Art Deco splendor. Every man wore a tuxedo, every woman draped in beaded gowns, all dancing through massive sets that cost millions. Bogdanovich filmed in black and white, then had the audacity to switch to color weeks into production, requiring complete reconstruction of every costume and set to work with the new format. Critics eviscerated the film with unprecedented savagery. Roger Ebert called it astounding in its incompetence, while Rex Reed quipped it was like watching a 2-hour funeral. Audiences walked out of theaters in droves. Reynolds later admitted he couldn't watch the finished film without cringing, while Shepherd's singing was compared to cats fighting in an alley. The humiliation was so complete that Bogdanovich took out full-page newspaper ads apologizing for the film. His career never fully recovered from what became known as Hollywood's most embarrassing vanity project, a $6 million flop that proved even the greatest directors can't manufacture musical talent in tone-deaf stars. 4. The Swarm, 1978. Disaster movie King Irwin Allen assembled perhaps the most impressive cast ever, for what should have been the ultimate killer B epic. Michael Caine, Henry Fonda, Richard Widmark, Olivia de Havilland, Jose Ferrer, Patty Duke, Slim Pickens, and Fred McMurray all collected hefty paychecks to run screaming from millions of angry African bees invading Texas. Warner Brothers poured $21 million into this monstrosity, expecting another towering Inferno-level blockbuster. The production featured 800,000 real bees supplemented by optical effects, with crew members in beekeeping suits administering antihistamines to cast members between takes. One spectacular sequence showed the bees causing a nuclear power plant meltdown, while another featured them derailing a passenger train by attacking the conductor, both requiring enormous practical effects budgets. Critics stung harder than Z. Film's Insects. Time magazine called it the disaster of disaster movies, while the New York Times labeled it spectacularly awful. Audiences agreed, and the film earned a pitiful $7 million. The Swarm swept the inaugural Razzie Awards, with Allen accepting his Worst Director trophy in good humor. Michael Caine later confessed, "I did it for the money and the work, but it wasn't a film I can take pride in." The film's legacy lives on only as the punchline to Hollywood cautionary tales about throwing astronomical budgets at absurd premises, no matter how many Oscar winners you cast. 5. Meteor, 1979. When a 5-mile-wide space rock hurtles toward Earth, only Sean Connery and his secret nuclear missiles can save humanity. American International Pictures bet $16 million on this star-studded disaster film, featuring Natalie Wood, Karl Malden, and Henry Fonda alongside Connery. The concept was ironclad. Combine the towering Inferno's all-star cast formula with 2001 space spectacle and Cold War nuclear tensions. The production spared no expense on groundbreaking effects. The Meteor's destruction sequences required 108 separate optical elements for a single shot, the most complex special effects attempted until that time. A massive water tank was built to film New York's flooding, while the avalanche sequence used 125 tons of artificial snow. The finale required detonating actual buildings in downtown Hong Kong under government supervision. Despite the technical ambition, audiences yawned at what the New York Times called a very dull movie. The special effects, revolutionary for their time, appeared embarrassingly fake compared to Star Wars 2 years earlier. Connery seemed visibly bored, later admitting he took the role purely for the paycheck. The film earned just $8.4 million, bankrupting American International Pictures and ending the 1970s disaster movie cycle. Director Ronald Neame later reflected, "We spent millions creating destruction that audiences simply didn't care about. Hollywood learned its lesson. Even Sean Connery can't save a movie when the most compelling performer is a styrofoam rock." 6. Zabriskie Point, 1970. What happens when a legendary European art director gets $7 million to capture the American counterculture? Michelangelo Antonioni's Zabriskie Point was MGM's disastrous attempt to tap into the youth market with a hallucinatory road movie featuring non-professional actors, explicit love scenes in the desert, and a mansion exploding in super slow motion to Pink Floyd music. The Italian maestro behind Blow Up approached the project with uncompromising artistic vision. He auditioned 8,000 unknown actors before casting Mark Frechette, a 19-year-old he spotted yelling at a bus stop. The Death Valley orgy scene required 200 naked extras covered in red dust and 110-degree heat. For the climactic explosion sequence, Antonioni destroyed a real Bel Air mansion and its contents, filming with 17 cameras at different speeds to create the most expensive slow-motion destruction ever filmed. Critics were baffled, and audiences stayed away. The film earned less than $900,000 against its enormous budget, becoming one of MGM's most catastrophic financial failures. Studio executive James Aubrey reportedly screamed at Antonioni after seeing the final cut, "You just lost me $7 million." The film effectively ended Hollywood's brief courtship with European art directors. Lead actor Frechette later joined a radical commune and died in prison after participating in a bank robbery. Pink Floyd's soundtrack contributions, including Heartbeat, Pigmeat, became more famous than the film itself. Today, Zabriskie Point stands as a spectacular time capsule of how completely the Hollywood establishment misunderstood the counterculture it was desperate to commodify. 7. Lost Horizon, 1973, Columbia. Pictures gambled $12 million on turning James Hilton's classic novel into a big-budget musical starring Peter Finch, Liv Ullmann, and John Gielgud. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Producer Ross Hunter, known for glossy Doris Day comedies, envisioned a roadshow spectacle that would capture the splendor of Shangri-La with elaborate musical numbers and exotic visuals. The production design was genuinely impressive. The Shangri-La sets covered 3 sound stages with artificial mountains, working waterfalls, and Buddhist temples constructed at enormous expense. Over 100 dancers performed elaborate Bacharach David musical numbers and sequences that each cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The costume department created 3,000 exotic outfits, including hand-embroidered ceremonial robes. Critics dismembered the film with unprecedented glee. Pauline Kael called it the worst movie musical ever made, while Vincent Canby described it as a big, stale marshmallow. Audiences howled with laughter during serious scenes, particularly when 54-year-old Charles Boyer performed an awkward dance number. The film earned just $3 million, less than a quarter of its budget. Columbia frantically re-edited it multiple times, cutting nearly 40 minutes of musical sequences in a desperate attempt to salvage it. The disaster ended producer Ross Hunter's career and marked the death knell for the big-budget Hollywood musical. Star Peter Finch reportedly told friends, "I've just finished the worst picture ever made." Lost Horizon became a textbook example of Hollywood hubris, proving that throwing millions at a beloved property while completely misunderstanding its appeal creates nothing but legendary failures. 8. Exorcist II, The Heretic, 1977. How do you follow one of the most profitable horror films ever made? Warner Brothers answered with a metaphysical sequel about telepathic locusts, African tribal ceremonies, and James Earl Jones in a giant locust costume. Director John Boorman received $14 million to create what he called a metaphysical thriller that would explore the nature of good and evil, rather than just scare audiences. The production was plagued with bizarre creative decisions. Boorman built a plexiglass mirrored set that overheated so severely it warped the camera equipment. Linda Blair returned as Regan, now wearing a bizarre device called a synchronizer that allowed Richard Burton's priest character to tap into her memories. One sequence required filming thousands of locusts, which technicians refrigerated to keep docile, only to have the insects revive under hot set lights and swarm through the studio. The premiere audience in New York literally laughed and threw things at the screen. William Friedkin, director of the original, stormed out claiming, "It's the worst piece of trash I've ever seen." Warner Brothers panicked and pulled the film from theaters after just 2 weeks for re-editing, but the damage was done. Critics competed for the most creative insults, with the New York Times calling it an insult to the intelligence. Despite the disaster, the film actually turned a small profit thanks to curiosity seekers, though the studio considered it a catastrophic failure compared to the original's success. Linda Blair's career never recovered from the debacle. Boorman later admitted, "The sin I committed was not giving the audience what it wanted." The film remains a fascinating case study in how completely a sequel can misunderstand what made its predecessor successful. 9. The Island of Dr. Moreau, 1977. Before Marlon Brando donned white makeup for the disastrous 1996 remake, Michael York and Burt Lancaster starred in this lavish adaptation of H.G. Wells's classic novel about a mad scientist creating human-animal hybrids. American International Pictures invested $6 million, their largest budget ever, convinced they had the perfect combination of literary prestige and exploitation horror. The production filmed entirely on Saint Croix in the Virgin Islands, where the elaborate makeup effects for the Beastmen had to be completely redesigned due to the tropical humidity melting the prosthetics. Over 50 makeup artists worked around the clock creating the creature effects. Lancaster performed his own stunts despite being 63 years old, including a harrowing sequence where he wrestled a real tiger that got loose on set and attacked a camera operator. Critics savaged the film as tasteless exploitation masquerading as literary adaptation. Time magazine called it a catalog of miscalculations, while others mocked the creature designs as men in bad Halloween costumes. The film earned just $4 million, devastating AIP's finances. Director Don Taylor and Lancaster publicly argued about the film's failures, with the actor claiming extensive reshoots ruined Taylor's original vision. The Island of Dr. Moreau vanished from theaters within weeks, overshadowed by Star Wars' continuing domination of the box office. The makeup effects team, led by John Chambers, who secretly worked on the CIA's Canadian hostage extraction immortalized in Argo, considered the film their greatest professional disappointment. AIP never recovered financially and was absorbed by Filmways the following year, ending a legendary exploitation studio's independence with a failed attempt at mainstream respectability. 10. Zardoz, 1974. Following the success of Deliverance, director John Boorman convinced 20th Century Fox to fund his bizarre sci-fi vision starring Sean Connery as Zed, a barbarian warrior who discovers the truth about his post-apocalyptic world. The film's most memorable image? Connery, wearing nothing but a red bandolier, thigh-high boots, and a ponytail emerging from a giant floating stone head called Zardoz that vomits guns to primitive exterminators. The $1.6 million production was filmed entirely in Ireland, with Boorman building elaborate sets representing the Vortex, a paradise where immortals live in perpetual boredom, protected by a force field. The immortals wore transparent plastic costumes designed to show they had evolved beyond shame, while Connery's barbarian clothes were deliberately primitive. For the floating stone head sequences, Boorman constructed constructed a 25-foot fiberglass face that required 8 technicians to operate from inside. Critics were stunned by the film's incomprehensibility. Roger Ebert wrote, "The movie never makes any sense," while Pauline Kael called it a stunningly crackpot mess. Audiences were equally baffled, and the film earned barely $1.8 million, a humiliating failure for the former James Bond. Fox executives reportedly walked out of early screenings, with one claiming, "I have no idea what I just watched." Connery later admitted he only took the role because he was desperate for work after leaving the Bond franchise, saying, "I just needed the money." The film developed a cult following decades later for its sheer audacity and unintentional camp value, but at the time it was considered career suicide for everyone involved. As Borman himself later acknowledged, "I was given complete freedom and used it to create something few people understood." Zardoz stands as perhaps the most baffling star vehicle of the decade, proving that even James Bond has limits to his box office appeal. 11. Myra Breckinridge, 1970. 20th Century Fox bet millions on this adaptation of Gore Vidal's controversial novel about a transgender woman who sets out to destroy masculinity in Hollywood. The production was cursed from the start, with Rex Reed and Raquel Welch cast as the pre- and post-operation versions of the same character. Director Michael Sarn, who had made only one previous film, was given complete creative control despite his inexperience. The troubled shoot became Hollywood legend. Mae West, returning to the screen after 26 years at age 77, refused to be in the same room as Raquel Welch. Welch and Reed barely spoke to each other. Sarn shot over 240 hours of footage, while periodically shutting down production to meditate on his vision. The director inserted random clips from classic Fox films without permission, leading to lawsuits from Shirley Temple and Loretta Young, who were horrified at their inclusion in the film's sexual context. The finished product was a catastrophe. Time magazine called it about as funny as a child molester, while the New York Times labeled it an insult to intelligence, imagination, and the human eye. Audiences were equally repulsed, and the film earned just $2.7 million against its substantial budget. Gore Vidal unsuccessfully sued to have his name removed from the credits, claiming the adaptation had nothing to do with his novel. The film's notorious rape scene, where Welch assaults a macho actor with a dildo, was considered so offensive that many critics walked out of screenings. Fox executives were so embarrassed they buried the film, refusing to release it on home video for decades. Myra Breckinridge effectively ended Sarn's Hollywood career and damaged Welch's credibility as a serious actress. It remains a fascinating time capsule of Hollywood's clumsy attempts to capitalize on changing sexual politics and the counterculture it fundamentally didn't understand. 12. Sextette, 1978. What happens when an 85-year-old Mae West stars as an irresistible sex symbol surrounded by men a third her age? Cinematic catastrophe. Crown International Pictures somehow convinced West to make her final film, a musical comedy where she plays a world-famous movie star who can't keep Olympic athletes, Arab sheiks, and British royalty away from her bedroom. The production was a sad spectacle behind the scenes. West couldn't remember her lines and had to wear an earpiece with a crew member reading her dialogue, which she would repeat seconds later. She couldn't walk unassisted. Those scenes were filmed with her standing in place while younger actors moved around her. The film's 6 husbands included Timothy Dalton, Ringo Starr, and Dom DeLuise, all visibly uncomfortable performing romantic scenes with an actress old enough to be their grandmother. Critics were both appalled and fascinated. Roger Ebert called it unwatchable, unbearable, unbelievable, while The Village Voice described it as like watching your dead grandmother's exhumed corpse being molested. The film vanished after a brief theatrical run, earning less than $50,000 against its $3 million budget. Director Ken Hughes later called it the most humiliating experience of my professional life. The real tragedy was West herself, once Hollywood's most provocative sex symbol, now reduced to a bizarre parody of her former persona. Her famous one-liners like, "Is that a gun in your pocket, or are you just happy to see me?" became uncomfortable when delivered by a performer who clearly didn't understand what she was saying. West died 2 years later, with Sextette serving as a painful final chapter to what had been a groundbreaking career of a feminist icon who controlled her image and career in an era when few women could. 13. Tora, 1970. Fox bet $25 million on this meticulous recreation of the Pearl Harbor attack, convinced that historical accuracy and spectacular battle sequences would deliver another Longest Day-style blockbuster. The ambitious production featured separate American and Japanese film units, working simultaneously with different directors, including the legendary Akira Kurosawa, who was fired early in production. The scale was genuinely impressive. The Japanese unit constructed full-size replica warplanes, while the American team worked with the U.S. Navy to choreograph elaborate battle sequences using actual military ships. Effects teams developed new techniques for creating realistic explosions and miniature battleship models. Over 500 actors and 5,000 extras participated in what was essentially two films being made simultaneously. Despite the technical achievements, American audiences stayed away, and the film earned just $14 million domestically, though it performed well in Japan. Critics praised the historical accuracy, but found the presentation cold and clinical. Roger Ebert called it one of the deadest, dullest blockbusters ever made, while The New Yorker described it as the cinematic equivalent of a long footnote. Fox executives, who had rejected making MAS to fund Tora, watched in horror as the former became a cultural phenomenon while their expensive war epic faded quickly from theaters. Director Richard Fleischer later reflected, "We recreated history with unprecedented accuracy, but forgot to make it entertaining." The film found new life decades later as a cable television staple and influenced the visual approach of later war films, but its initial commercial failure effectively ended Hollywood's appetite for massive historical recreations for nearly 20 years. 14. The Wiz, 1978, Universal Pictures and Motown Productions gambled $24 million on urban reinvention of The Wizard of Oz, starring 33-year-old Diana Ross as teenager Dorothy, Michael Jackson as the Scarecrow, and Richard Pryor as the Wizard. What began as a modestly budgeted adaptation of the Broadway hit transformed into one of the most expensive films of the decade when producer Rob Cohen convinced the studio to move the setting from Harlem to a fantasy version of New York City. The production was a masterclass in escalating costs. Director Sidney Lumet insisted on filming entirely on location in New York, including transforming the newly completed World Trade Center Plaza into the Emerald City using 650 dancers and 385 crew members. One musical number required rebuilding portions of Coney Island with copper panels. The Poppy Girls sequence featured 100 performers on wirework harnesses that kept malfunctioning, extending filming for days. Critics were merciless. The Washington Post called it a nightmarish $20 million bust, while Gene Siskel described it as a bloated, boring production. Even Michael Jackson, in a rare criticism, later said the film wasn't well planned. The box office was catastrophic, earning just $13 million and losing Universal nearly $11 million. The failure temporarily derailed the film careers of nearly everyone involved, particularly Ross, who never again starred in a major motion picture. The film's failure had lasting industry impact. Motown Productions effectively ceased making films, while Universal implemented strict budget controls. The disaster also reinforced Hollywood's reluctance to finance big-budget, all-black productions for years afterward. Joel Schumacher, who wrote the screenplay, later called it a perfect storm of bad decisions. Only decades later did The Wiz find appreciation as a cult classic, with stunning Quincy Jones musical arrangements and a historical document of Michael Jackson just before his solo superstardom. 15 Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, 1978, Robert Stigwood, riding high after Saturday Night Fever, convinced Universal to spend $18 million on a musical fantasy built entirely around Beatles songs performed by the Bee Gees and Peter Frampton. The film reimagined the iconic album as a literal place where Sgt. Pepper's band protects magical instruments that keep the town harmonious until evil forces steal them. The production assembled a bizarre ensemble including Steve Martin, Alice Cooper, Aerosmith, Earth, Wind & Fire, and George Burns, singing Beatles classics while surrounded by elaborate fantasy sequences. Over 50 recognizable celebrities appeared in a recreation of the famous album cover. The costume department created over 1,000 outfits, including the custom-tailored blue Sgt. Pepper uniforms worn by the Bee Gees. The climactic Battle of the Bands sequence required building an entire stadium set filled with 1,500 extras. Critics responded with unprecedented savagery. Newsweek called it a film with a dangerous resemblance to wallpaper, while Rolling Stone labeled it $9 million worth of contrived whimsy. Beatles fans were particularly outraged, viewing it as sacrilege against their musical heroes. The film earned just $12 million, becoming one of the most expensive musical failures until that time. The soundtrack album, expected to sell millions, was returned to stores by the truckload. Producer Robert Stigwood's reputation never recovered. Peter Frampton, already facing career decline after his record-breaking live album, was pushed into irrelevance. Only the Bee Gees escaped relatively unscathed, protected by their Saturday Night Fever success. The film became a warning about the dangers of building movies around conceptual albums, regardless of the original music's popularity. As one Universal executive reportedly said, "We made the cardinal mistake of thinking people would pay to see bad covers of songs they already owned." From nuclear reactors menaced by killer bees to psychedelic visions in the desert, these massive 70s productions remind us that even unlimited budgets can't save bad ideas. Which of these forgotten spectacles deserves a modern reassessment? Would any of them become hits with today's audiences? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more cinematic archaeology.